Chicago, 1937. Chicago never slept at night. It only closed its eyes and kept breathing. The wind rising from Lake Michigan poured into the streets, carrying the smell of rust, coal, and old sins. Brick buildings looked as if they were tired of witnessing years of crime, their windows dark, their walls stained with soot. Neon signs flickered, their light seeping into the cracks between the pavement stones. The year 1937 weighed heavily on the city's back. The echoes of the Great Depression still howled through the empty factory chimneys, and people went on surviving as if it were a habit. The police were tired. Criminals were bold. Justice was often late. Edgar Blackwood knew this city. He had fought it. He had bargained with it. And more often than not, he had lost. His office on Michigan Boulevard was a narrow, long room several floors above the noise of the street. Old case files, yellowed photographs, and the silent witnesses of unsolved crimes hung on the walls. The desk by the window carried the fatigue of its wood. On it lay a half-finished cup of coffee, a dulled pencil, and an unopened envelope. Even Edgar didn't know how long the envelope had been there. That morning, before the city had fully awakened, the sound of sirens began drifting in from afar. Edgar could tell them apart. Which siren meant urgency, which was merely routine. This one was urgent. Too urgent. When the knock came, Edgar didn't rise from his desk. The way it was knocked told him who stood on the other side. Police liked to knock, but they knocked impatiently. Because they never had time. Because they were usually too late. When the door opened, cold air filled the room. Then came a gray silhouette. Detective Harold Pierce was one of the city's oldest faces. His hair had turned white early, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep, his shoulders slumped as if he were always carrying a burden. The overcoat he wore had fought Chicago winters more times than it could remember. Pierce stepped inside but didn't close the door. As if he would be leaving again in a moment.
"There's a body."
His tone was tired. Devoid of detail. But Edgar sensed that this fatigue was different. The word body didn't move Edgar. In Chicago, bodies were as common as rain. But there was no familiar indifference in Pierce's eyes. There was unease, the look of a man who had encountered something he couldn't make sense of. Edgar took his coat. He preferred to ask questions on the way. Because some answers couldn't be given without seeing the place. The warehouse on the south side stood in one of the city's forgotten corners. Close to the railroad tracks, an old structure coated in coal dust and rust. At night, only rats and men who had lost their conscience wandered there. Police tape was up, but there was no crowd. That was a good sign. The newspapers hadn't arrived yet. The scene hadn't been contaminated. When Edgar stepped inside the warehouse, the first thing he noticed was the smell. It wasn't the smell of fire. It was more like the ghost of a fire long gone. The floor was clean. There was no soot on the walls. The ceiling was intact. But something lay in the center. Or rather, someone who had once been there. William McDull's body lay on the concrete floor. Or what remained of it. Most of his clothes had turned to ash. His skin was covered in irregular yet severe burn marks. His face was still recognizable, but his eyes were left open. Edgar crouched down. Took a closer look. This wasn't a fire. Fires left traces. Escape marks. Paths of smoke. Panic. There was no panic here. Only the result. Forensics hadn't arrived yet. In 1937, everything was slow. Even death. Pierce stood behind him. He didn't speak. He let Edgar think. Because that was what Edgar did, he looked, he stayed silent, he listened. He listened to what the city was telling him. Something small caught Edgar's eye, glinting on the ground. On the concrete floor, a few steps away from the body, lay a small metal object. A pocket watch. Its glass was cracked. The lid slightly open. Edgar picked up the watch. It had stopped. 3:17. In that moment, Edgar knew this wasn't an ordinary murder. People died in Chicago. But not like this. And some deaths refused to be solved at first glance. This was one of them. William McDull's name was not a bad one in Chicago. On the contrary, it was a respected name. That was the first thing Edgar noticed. Newspaper clippings, trade bulletins, and old city records always described McDull the same way: stable, reliable, quiet. For a man in the coal business, these traits meant survival. He wouldn't speak too much, wouldn't draw attention, but he would always win. And being respected was an important achievement. Edgar spent hours in the city archives building. In 1937, accessing information was a laborious task. Files were tangible, and lies were often more permanent than ink. As he turned the pages, McDull's name appeared again and again in the same places: strikes, minor accidents, short notices. None of them had made the headlines. So what was the reason for the death? But some reports, especially the smaller ones, caught Edgar's attention. A mining accident. The date was old. The details were missing. The report said only this: following the accident, the company accepted no responsibility. How familiar. Edgar examined the city records from the year the accident occurred. At the time, McDull's company was in a phase of expansion. Profits had increased. Within the same year, several union representatives had stepped down from their positions. And in that same year, a woman had died. Her name appeared in a small note. Margaret McDull. Wife. Mother. Shortly after the accident. No cause of death was specified. Only an unfortunate incident. Edgar lingered on that phrase. He closed the file. In Chicago, the phrase unfortunate incident usually meant that someone didn't want to talk. When Edgar went to McDull's house, the sky was overcast. The house stood on the north side, in a quieter but colder part of the city. It wasn't large, but it was orderly. Nothing in the front yard was unnecessary. That suggested the homeowner liked control. The young woman who opened the door showed no surprise on her face. It was as if she had known someone would eventually come. Calm and self-assured. Eleanor McDull. When Edgar first saw her, he thought she resembled her father. The same vacant gaze. The same measured posture. But there was something in her that her father lacked: restrained restlessness. Her eyes were constantly searching for something. An escape route. Or a moment she didn't want to remember. Edgar did not miss these details. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Everything was in its place, but there was no warmth. Family photographs hung on the walls. Most of them were old. There were very few photographs of her mother. It seemed like a deliberate choice. Edgar surveyed the room without speaking. Some questions were answered without being asked. As Eleanor spoke about her father's death, she chose her words carefully. She neither appeared overly distressed nor at ease. Grief seemed like a habit to her. She had lost before. There was a sense of numbness about her. Edgar placed her account alongside the city records in his mind. Some sentences were missing. Some memories had been deliberately omitted. Eleanor's voice didn't tremble. But her hands, without her noticing, were gripping the edge of her dress. When Edgar left the house, he didn't look back. But a signal had lit up in his mind. Blood ties did not eliminate suspicion. Sometimes, they magnified it. Later, Edgar made his way through McDull's business circle. Former partners, silent accountants, indebted subcontractors. They all said the same thing: McDull was a difficult man, but he had no enemies. That only made Edgar more suspicious. In Chicago, a man with no enemies was either very powerful, or very good at hiding. Late that night, Edgar returned to his office. He opened a small notebook on his desk and wrote down the names of the suspects. Strike leaders. Chemical company connections. A man from the city. Eleanor McDull. His pen paused for a moment. Adding the daughter to the list was not easy. But Edgar didn't work with emotions, he worked with gaps. The distance between what Eleanor said and what she didn't say had pushed her onto that list. He opened his desk drawer and took out the photograph of the pocket watch. The watch was still stopped at 3:17. Some people wanted to stop time. Others chose the time. Edgar looked out the window. The Chicago night was awake again. The city was about to give him another secret. And he could feel that there would be a price to pay. In Chicago, science was slow. Truth was impatient. Edgar was at the medical examiner's building early in the morning. The structure, wedged between hospitals and police stations, resembled an old building made of gray stone. Inside, there was a heavy chemical smell, formaldehyde, old metal, and exhausted bodies. In 1937, death was not yet something fully understood. It was merely categorized. McDull's body lay on a metal table. The lighting was poor. The lamps flickered as if they were trying to hide details. Edgar looked carefully. The burns were still asking the same question. There was heat. But no fire. The forensic reports could not say anything definitive about the source of the burns. Electricity had been ruled out, the warehouse line had been shut off that night. There were no signs of a gas leak. The possibility of a fire was almost non-existent. Yet the report, out of habit, recorded the cause of death as exposure to high heat. Edgar folded the report. Documents like these rarely explained the truth, they merely soothed it. As he left the building, he felt the weight of something in his pocket. The pocket watch. The watch was still stopped. Its mechanism had been examined, but the cracked glass had not been replaced. No one wanted to touch it. Because no one knew what they were looking at. Edgar's path led him to the back streets near an old chemical facility on the south side of the city. Signs were scarce there, and questions were dangerous. In 1930 Chicago, chemistry did not only mean medicine and cleaning agents. There were industrial accelerants, experimental substances left over from military stockpiles, and compounds that never made it into official records. Edgar followed the trail of a laboratory that had been shut down long ago. The building's windows were darkened, its door chained shut. But even if people left, information remained. Fear, especially, seeped into the walls. He found a former laboratory worker. The man's name still existed in records, but the city had long since erased him. His hair was thinning, his hands constantly trembling. Edgar didn't push him. If you pushed people, they stayed silent. If you waited, they spoke. When the man listened to the description of the burns, he lifted his head. Something familiar appeared in his eyes, not fear, but remembrance. He said only one word.
Phosphorus.
He offered no further explanation. He didn't need to. Edgar felt the weight of that word. White phosphorus, something that burned intensely but briefly, that could not be stopped even with water. It destroyed what it touched, not what surrounded it. There was burning. But no fire. Edgar knew this information would never enter the official reports. Because substances like that implied responsibility. And responsibility was not something anyone liked in Chicago, 1937. That evening, as Edgar was returning to his office, he felt that he was being followed. This wasn't a fleeting instinct. The echo of footsteps stopped when he stopped. When he walked again, they resumed. Someone was maintaining their distance well. Experienced, but not professional. At one point, he saw the reflection in a window. A long coat. A slender posture. Eleanor McDull. Edgar kept walking. He didn't turn around. Being followed was sometimes more honest than being questioned. When he reached his office, he didn't turn on the lights. He stood by the window. The darkness of the city whispered fragments of the truth to him. He didn't know why Eleanor was following him. But he knew this much: innocent people did not follow detectives. He sat at his desk and looked again at the list of suspects. Under Eleanor's name, he placed a small mark. Not a question mark. A line. Because some suspicions were not asked. They were simply watched. Pocket watches reminded people not of time, but of control. In 1937, if a man carried a watch in his pocket, it meant he feared being late. Or that he didn't want to miss something. Edgar placed McDull's watch on his desk. The glass was cracked, but the mechanism appeared intact. It had been taken to a watchmaker. The man spoke of a simple malfunction. A hard impact. Sudden. The spring inside the watch had jammed precisely at 3:17. Watches like these did not stop on their own. Time had been forced to stop. Edgar began reconstructing McDull's final days. Police records were incomplete, witnesses reluctant. But the city could never fully hide its traces. Harbor logs, warehouse entry and exit schedules, night watchman's signature books, all were examined one by one. One name stood out. Samuel Hargreaves. McDull's former accountant. He had left the company in recent months. The date of his departure was dangerously close to McDull's death. Edgar was used to such connections. Men who understood money also understood secrets. And sometimes secrets were heavier than murder. The apartment building where Hargreaves lived stood near the river. A narrow structure that smelled of dampness. When Edgar opened the door, the air inside was heavy. The man was afraid. That much was clear. But fear did not always mean guilt. Sometimes it was simply an instinct to survive. Hargreaves's account was consistent. He knew McDull had covered up certain accidents. But he claimed that the reason he left was not money, but conscience. Edgar noted the answer, but did not lock it into his mind. Because conscience was an expensive luxury in Chicago. That same evening, Edgar found old hospital records related to Eleanor McDull's mother. The files were incomplete. Some pages had been torn out. But one report was striking. Burns. Prolonged. Slow. Her mother had not died instantly in an accident. She had lived for hours. And during that time, no newspaper, no official authority had come near the building. When Edgar closed the file, a heavy feeling settled in his chest. Deaths like that were not forgotten. Especially by children. It was then that Edgar first understood why Eleanor was so composed. Some people carried pain not by screaming, but by accumulating it. Toward midnight, Edgar found an envelope in front of his office. It had been pushed under the door. Inside was only one thing, a small, yellowed piece of paper. On it, there was only an address. And a time. 3:17. In that moment, Edgar thought he had been wrong. That he might have placed suspicion in the wrong place. When he went to the address, he saw that it was an old mining site. No longer in use. But once, it had belonged to McDull's company. It was the place where the accident had occurred. Edgar stood in the darkness for a while. As the wind passed through the abandoned structure, it produced metallic sounds. As if the ground itself still wanted to speak. This address was not a threat. It was a reminder. When Edgar returned, he looked at his list. He drew a line next to Hargreaves's name. He removed him from the suspects. He had been wrong. This was his first major misjudgment. Because the real question was no longer who had killed. The real question was this. Who had waited years for this death? And Edgar could no longer deny that the answer came from McDull's own blood. Edgar could now reconstruct the murder in his mind from beginning to end. Every step. Every pause. Every moment of waiting. In 1937, a murder was committed not with speed, but with patience. Technology caught hurried killers. But not those who waited. Eleanor McDull's preparation had stretched across years. Edgar understood that now. Her knowledge of chemistry had not come from a school, but from observation. From newspapers, old reports, the shadows of shut-down laboratories. Choosing white phosphorus had not been a coincidence. This substance was the same fire that had killed her mother. It carried the same pain, the same loneliness. But without burning the surroundings. Only the target. Edgar thought through the details of that night in McDull's warehouse. The distance between father and daughter. Eleanor's approach. Perhaps a handshake. Perhaps just brief contact. Something so small, so ordinary that it drew no attention. Then the waiting. White phosphorus did not rush. It had time. McDull had been alone. He had not been able to call out to anyone. There was no fire, that was why no one had run to help. Only the body had burned, and the building had remained silent. The moment he dropped his watch was clear in Edgar's mind. The moment the pain began. The moment time stopped. 3:17. Edgar went to Eleanor's house one last time. This time he did not go inside. He only watched from across the street. There was no light in the window. The house stood like a monument. It held the silence of a life that had been lived, and ended. In the garden, he noticed that the soil had been disturbed slightly. It wasn't new. But it wasn't very old either. Edgar crouched down. The soil was still soft. There, he found a small metal box. Inside were the following. Old newspaper clippings. Incomplete reports from the mining accident. Torn pages from her mother's hospital records. And at the bottom, a small bottle. Empty. These were no longer mementos. They were evidence. When Edgar entered the police station, dawn was just breaking. The inside of the building was cold, as always. The walls had listened to the same sounds for years, denials, confessions, silences. Edgar placed the file on the desk. He didn't speak. He didn't explain. The documents were clear enough to speak for themselves. In 1937, evidence spoke, people did not. When Pierce opened the file, his expression didn't change. But his gaze grew heavier. Edgar knew he understood everything. No questions followed. Because some questions arrived already carrying their answers. Eleanor McDull was taken from her home that morning. She didn't resist. She didn't run. It was as if she had accepted this moment long ago. There was no regret on her face. No relief either. Only the quiet of a waiting that had ended. Edgar saw her from a distance in the corridor of the station. They didn't make eye contact. There was no need. Everything between them had already been said. When Edgar returned to his office, he placed the pocket watch on his desk. For the first time, he considered replacing the glass. But he decided against it. The cracked glass showed time as it truly was. The watch was still stopped. But it no longer mattered. Because in this case, time had finally found its place. Edgar walked to the window. Chicago was breathing again. The city may not have been rid of another crime. But this time, the truth had not been left in the dark. Edgar Blackwood knew one thing. Justice did not always bring comfort. Sometimes, it simply brought an end. And sometimes, ending was enough.